Welcome, ghouls, ghosts, and mere mortals, to the third episode of our multi-episode series where we build our cemetery fence. Now, in the first episode, we showed you guys how we got the fence and how to build a fence of your own. In the second episode, we built the base to our columns. And in this episode, we are going to build the tops of the columns, and we're going to paint them, weather them, make them look like they've been sitting in a graveyard for hundreds of years. It's a pretty exciting episode. I'm glad you guys are here to join us. If you missed the first two episodes, I'll leave links to both of them in the comments section below. But let's get straight into it. Let's get to building. Somehow I did not record myself cutting the base to the tops, or maybe I did and I just lost the video file, but can't seem to find it anywhere, so I'll just have to explain that what I did was I took a 2-inch piece of foam and I cut it 4 inches wider on either side than the pillars, so that way it has a 2-inch overhang on all 4 sides of the pillar. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get into the rest of how I put together the tops. So the pillars that we got from Johnson City have kind of a 2-layer approach where they have the larger part that's the 2-inch overhang and then a smaller part on top. So what I did was I cut a 1-inch piece of foam, basically the same size as the pillars, so that way it would rest on top of that 2-inch piece of foam with 2 inches going all around it. And to line it up, I just kind of did a corner to corner X on both the base and that top piece. Not sure how much that actually helped, but I just lined up those X's, and then once I lined it up, then I got out my measuring tape and made sure that I was even on all 4 sides. Once that was good, I outlined that top piece and then just put some spray foam down, lined it back up on top of it, and then put something heavy on it for it to dry. Now for the underside of the tops, I wanted to make sure that they aren't going to fall off very easily. So I measured the inside of the pillars, and then I cut a piece of 2-inch foam to match that. And then kind of the same process here. I made sure that it was centered in the middle of the base, outlined it once again, and then used that spray foam and weighed it down and waited for it to dry. And then once the foam dried, it was time to start adding some of the weathering effects to make it look like it's not freshly cut stone, make it look like it's been there for quite some time. So the first thing I did was I just took my saw and kind of roughed up some spots along the edge. Did it kind of manually. I even kind of used the saw and dug into the side of the foam just to kind of break away that perfectly straight line. Now that saw does leave some pretty rough cuts, so then I took my rasp and kind of scraped along it, almost like just to kind of blend it in a little bit more with the rest of the foam, and it was still kind of rough. So then I just kind of went over it with my sander, and then I also just kind of rounded out the sides, because my idea for these pillars is that they've been here for hundreds of years, and that erosion over time will round out those corners and edges. So I wanted to make that look a little bit more natural. And that's it for now on the tops. So let's move on to filling the gaps between the edges of the pillars and also cleaning up some debris left over. So first off, before we can even fill those gaps, there were spots where that foam had leaked through. You could use a saw, you could use a knife. In this situation, I used my putty knife just to get those little pieces off, so that way whenever it is time to put that joint compound in between, we don't have a lot of excess foam sticking out that will be very obvious that it's not real stone. And then I got to work on filling those gaps. Now, I'm using joint compound. You could use wood glue or joint compound, or I guess I'm sure there's other stuff that could be used as well. I just had joint compound available, so that's what I used. and I just filled those gaps. Don't worry about being messy with this. I'm not very good with this, as you can probably see here. I'm quite messy with it, but that's okay, because once we finish this and once it dries, we will sand it and make it nice and smooth. And then I also made sure to get around the base of the pillars where those corners met. If you watched the previous video, you might have noticed that I had some pretty big gaps, and no problem, I can fill it in with putty here. And like I said, once that's dry, sand it down, make it nice and smooth. So now that we've got the boring stuff out of the way, now it's time to get into some of the fun stuff. First thing that I wanted to do was add some cracks to give it a little bit more character. And it's pretty easy to do this. You just want to be careful not to overdo it. And the way I do this is I use just a knife or razor blade, and I outline kind of where I want those cracks to be. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can just kind of let the foam guide you as you make those cracks. And what works for me is I kind of go along that line, or try to stick to it as close as I can on one side, then I go to the other side and cut into it as well, so that way I can create that kind of gap, and it's not uniform, which is what we want. It's kind of all over the place. And then where the crack starts, I'll break that up even more, add some more of a gap in there, like a piece of concrete fell off, and then that's what caused this to begin with. So these cracks, because I am just kind of following the line and letting the foam kind of do its own thing, in some areas they'll be thicker, other areas will be thin. It'll look more natural, like real cracks. And then I did sand over it when I got done, just to make sure there wasn't any excess foam that just kind of stuck out that would give away the illusion of it being a natural crack. And then I took my rasp out and just went along the beginning of the crack, like I said, to make it look like maybe a chunk of that concrete fell off of the pillar. And then the pillars that we got from our Johnson City road trip, they had painted cracks on here, and those cracks looked just fine. They actually looked pretty good, realistic. But we wanted to step it up a notch, make it look a little bit more realistic. So I just took where they had originally drawn cracks into the pillar and used that as my outline to then cut these out. And now that we're finished with the cracks, it's time to move on to the corners. Yeah, so once again, we want these pillars to look like they've been here for hundreds of years. So if we have these nice, clean, straight corners, it's not going to look realistic. So I took my saw and just kind of went along the edge, and then wherever that foam would catch, I would just let it guide me and cut out just little bits and chunks of the corners. And then once I got those chunks cut out of the corners, I took my rasp and kind of evened it out a little bit and got rid of some of those harsh edges that the saw leaves behind. And then in certain areas, I also went back in with my sander and just smoothed it out a little bit more. You know, like it's cracked years and years ago, but now that the water's been running down it over the years, it's eroded it and kind of smoothed it out. And then once we got those corners done, it was time to move on to dry lock. Now, for any of you that are unaware of what dry lock is, it's kind of like a masonry paint. First off, it helps weatherproof your stuff, but also it adds a little bit of grain to it, so it makes it look more like concrete or rock. And I started with my cracks, and I tried to get into those cracks as much as possible. Now, what you didn't see here that I didn't think of, and the lady of the manor, who's much smarter than me, brought me a smaller brush to get into those cracks a little bit better. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to do more later with painting in the cracks. But once I covered up the cracks, then I got to work on the actual pillars, dry locking those, just covering everything with that dry lock. And you'll notice one thing that I did do here is I pat at the dry lock after I paint it. Typically I wait until I'm done with an entire side before doing that, but that way we get rid of any of those brush strokes so that way when it dries, it won't have those streaks. It will look more like real rock. And then this hurts, and I'm sorry to the haunter from Johnson City if you're watching this video. I hate to cover up someone else's artwork, and they did a great job. You know, they painted those cracks in there, they weathered these pillars, but I had to cover it up because I wanted everything to be uniform, so that way when I do my weathering, they all match each other. So I'm sorry for covering up your work, but I promise you I'm going to make these look really good, and hopefully you'll be okay with it. And then after we put Drylock over everything, I just did a coat of spray paint to make everything just that much more uniform and even, maybe even get into some of the cracks and crevices that I couldn't get into with the paintbrush. And, you know, really it's just to kind of make it a clean slate. So that way, when we start to go through the weathering process, it's all the same. Some pieces aren't going to be more weathered than others. So as you can see here, everything's nice and clean and gray. It's the last time you're going to see it like this, because in the next steps, we're going to weather this and make it look dirty and old and worn, like it's been sitting in this graveyard for years. So for the weathering process, I use 3 different colors of paint. I use black, green, and brown. Here's a screenshot of the ones I used if you want to use the same ones. You don't want to use expensive paint. I tried. Actually, it doesn't turn out as good. It doesn't work out as well. It clogs things up. Get the cheap craft paint. That, like I said, seems to work out best. Now, for the cracks and for the skulls, I did get in there with my paintbrush first to give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more weathering than the rest of the pillars. So as you can see here, I got my small brush out this time, and I'm just going into those cracks to give it a little bit more of a defined look, a little bit darker than what we're going to see on the rest of the pillars. And when you do this, you want to kind of water down your paint a little bit. You don't want it to be that harsh black. I did kind of a mixture, almost like a 50-50 between paint and water. And you also notice that it's starting to drip a little bit. And whenever you go through this, you don't want too much drip coming through, and you definitely don't want those very harsh lines. So keep a paper towel or a washcloth or something ready, and just wipe down whenever those drips happen. As you wipe down, it will kind of give it the effect of weathering without having to completely get rid of that black paint. And then on the skulls, kind of the same thing here. I think I went with a little bit more paint, maybe 75% to 25% paint to water. I still definitely want it watered down, but not as prominent as just straight black paint. And then just get into those gaps and cracks. Like, you know that the eyes and the nose and even the teeth and all the crevices on the skull, you're going to want to have those a little bit darker. That way when it's nighttime, you have your haunt lights out, just makes it that much more prevalent and noticeable. And now that we took care of the skulls and the cracks, it's time to start weathering the actual pillars. And my first run was a mixture of black paint and water. I mixed it up, put it in a spray bottle, sprayed it on. As you can see, not really any method to my madness here. But then the important thing is you want to then take, what I did was I took a washcloth and just go from top to bottom, just kind of lightly brushed down to get rid of those harsh lines or those splatter marks. This is what's going to give it the illusion of being old and weathered. If we leave those harsh lines, it doesn't look quite right. It looks more fake. So you want that to kind of blend in. Now, like I said, I start off kind of very lightly going down. If you notice that you're still getting those lines, you can go a little bit heavy-handed with that washcloth. And then for the tops, spray that water and paint mixture on top, This first layer, I did spread it out a little bit. I didn't want prominent dark spots. And, I mean, really, at this point, they're already looking pretty good. They look like they are aged. Maybe they've been there a few years. We can see that there are those kind of natural streaks. We don't have those harsh water lines going down the sides. There's a mixture of kind of light and dark, which is the look that we're going for. But we want to step it up a notch. We want to take it even further. We want these to look like they have been there, like I said, for hundreds of years. So let's move on to our next layer of paint, which is our green mixture. So for the green mixture, for every 1 part of green, I put in about half of brown and about 1/3 black. That's the color that I was going for. Feel free to play around with that, set it however you want. You don't want too bright of green. You want it to look kind of dull and more like a mold or mildew. And the exact same process that we did with the black. You spray it on, and then you wipe down. You spray it on, and you wipe down until you get the consistency and the look that you're going for. And then with the tops, I just sprayed them. I did not wipe them down. Just turned out pretty well, actually. Just because, really rain is going to hit these tops and it's going to react the exact same way that this is reacting. So why not just leave it? Actually, I was running out of paint at this point, so this one was a little bit different than the rest of them, but still, just looks like weathered stone. And at the base, I did not wipe away the excess water that dripped down, just to give it more of that illusion of where the water would have sat there naturally. And then after the green coat, I added a brown coat. In hindsight, I probably should have done the brown before the green, but just to give it that dingy, dirty look, just adds that one extra layer to make it look like it's actually worn and it's been there. But like I said, I should have done the brown first. So if you're doing this at home, do brown, then green. The tops of these pillars, I end up having to go back over them again with some green and black because they were just too brown. It just didn't look the way I wanted them to look. Now that we've done all the weathering, the last step is to spray a coat of clear coat on these just to keep them protected from the elements, to keep those paints from fading over the years. And after that clear coat, we're done with this part of the build. So let's take a look at the final results.
Alright guys, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. If you watched the previous episode, you might have remembered that we said that we were going to do a few other things that we didn't get to in this video. We ran out of time. It is what it is. It happens. So, we're going to have another episode. And the next episode, which is not going to be this week, it'll probably be in a couple weeks, but we're going to go over how we attach the lights to the two main columns. We're going to go over how we secure the columns to the ground and even how we attach the fence posts to the columns. So if you want to continue following us on this journey, then I would recommend subscribing to the channel. That way you can be notified when the next video comes out. But in the meantime, happy haunting. We'll see you in the next one.
Congratulations. You made it to the end of the video. As a reward for sticking around, you may now watch one of these two videos. The choice is yours, but choose wisely.